Welcome back to Humanities. And today we're going to finally turn our attention to ancient Rome, which is one of my favorite topics in the ancient world. We're going to do a historical overview of what's called the Roman Republic. We're going to watch this little teeny Latin city-state grow from being this one little city to being the master of the Mediterranean world, forming one of the most important empires in world history, the Roman Empire, which is going to have an influence not only on that particular time period, but it's going to leave its mark on the rest of Western civilization. Now, if you've never studied Roman history before, Roman history is generally broken into two major periods, what we call the Roman Republic and what we call the Roman Empire. Now, when you use the word empire, we're generally talking about where a particular political entity ends up dominating or conquering other territories. Now, the Romans actually have an empire long before we get to the Roman Empire period. What distinguishes the Roman Empire from the Roman Republic historically is the introduction of an actual emperor, a single ruler over Rome. And that's actually where we're going to stop this particular historical overview. I'm going to try to cover just the Republican period. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go a little bit earlier than the Republican period. I'm going to talk about the legendary foundings of Rome and the early kings and things like that. But I'm going to do it in a couple different sessions. There's so much material here that I'm going to break it up into at least two parts. Part one and part two. Now, this is kind of a struggle for me. Like I said, this is one of my favorite eras of ancient history, and it's such a temptation to want to dive in deeper than we have the time to do. In a course like this, which is really a survey course, we have to hit various highlights and skim over things, which we've been doing all semester, and you could literally do an entire course just on the Roman Republic or just on one part of the Roman Republic. So you can see how I'm going to struggle with this, and I'm going to want to jam a lot of stuff in here, which might make it a little bit too overwhelming at times and maybe takes away from the nice flow of a historical narrative. But I'm going to do my best to get you guys familiar with ancient Rome. So as we go, I'm going to point out some of the more important things to look at, especially with regards to how Rome will impact the future. So why don't we dive in and do a historical overview of the Roman Republic. 753 to 27 BC approximately, if we're going to use the traditional dates. And we're going to start by looking a little bit back before that with Bronze Age Italy. And I'm not going to spend much time here because, again, we don't have really history yet. We're dealing with archaeological remains for the most part. The material culture of ancient Italy, and we could talk about different changes in the culture. We have the Terramara culture up in the north along the Po River Valley. In the south, you could see the yellow on the map, which is the Mycenaean impact. You don't actually have Mycenaean settlements. We hopefully are really well familiar with the Mycenaeans by this point, right? The Bronze Age Greeks, which dominated the Greek mainland. These are the guys that went to Troy. They left the stories behind that would eventually impact the Homeric literature and later Greece. We'll see how they kind of engage, at least on a trade level, with the Italian peninsula. The other thing that I want to point out, by the way, is the map. Very, very distinct peninsula. You can never mistake Italy, hopefully, for any other country, though I have seen people do this. It's the boot, right? It's the boot that juts down into the Mediterranean Sea like it's about to kick the island of Sicily like a football. On the second map, on the right-hand side of the screen, you've got the spread of what's called the Urnfield culture, which is a culture that seems to have a big impact on the early Etruscans, particularly in their cremation burial. So this Urnfield culture, which was fairly widespread in the ancient world, we'll just mention briefly in a second. We'll show you some of the biconical, what are they called, urns that go with that culture in just a second. Okay, so let's talk about the early cultures of Italy. If you go back to the Bronze Age, we basically have the time period between 1800 and 1000 BC, Bronze Age Italy. The Apennine culture, which ran down the central portion of Italy, basically central to southern Italy, named after the Apennine Mountains, which were a distinctive geographical feature in Italy. This is a spine of the peninsula, runs right down the middle. Terramara culture, like I said, in the north, and then the Mycenaeans. Basically around 1400, you start to see Mycenaean material remains, which shows trade at least along the area of southern Italy. But by 1250, you've got Mycenaean trade as far north as Etruria, which we would refer to today as Tuscany, named after the Etruscans. Okay, we're going to get to them in just a second because they're a really important group. Between 1200 and 900, you see the emergence of the Proto-Villanovan Bronze Age culture, which is distinguished by its cremation burials, right? And these urns, which you can see a little bit of a picture of on the screen, seems to have been influenced by that urnfield culture, which I just mentioned, or potentially the Terramara culture of the north. Now, that burial custom is going to be continued into the Iron Age. About 1000 to 700, we call this the Iron Age period, and we move from a Proto-Villanovan to a Villanovan. And Villanovan is really just an early phase of these Etruscans. Here you see a typical biconical urn where you've got the urn on the bottom, which was for the cremated remains of the deceased. On top, you usually have some other kind of ceramic vessel placed upside down to seal it off. Sometimes you'd have an actual helmet placed on top of it, and I've actually got a bronze helmet showing on the screen right next to that. Okay, so that's very distinctive of this particular period. But the basic way that people buried or had burial practices and funerary rites was with the idea of cremation. Around the same time as we get into the early Iron Age, you have Greeks arrive in Italy for the first time. And we already know the importance of the Greek culture. They start colonizing southern Italy in the middle of the 8th century, around 760, with the first colony being at Punic Wars. This is one of the earliest Greek colonies, period, on the island of Ischia. And this is just off the coast of the region that will later be, Campania, Neapolis, Naples, and the successor colony, really the city of Cumae, which is going to be a really important player in kind of Greek and Roman interaction. We'll see the city of Cumae a little bit later as we cover the story of early Rome. But remember, these Greek colonies are independent states. Right? They're not even loyal to necessarily the homeland back in Greece, the city that originally sent out the colonists, but they're independent states, political units of their own, and they have a very strong cultural presence because it's the Greek culture that's going to have such a huge impact on the emerging Roman culture. And you don't want to ever forget how important that is, and you can't really miss it when we get into some of the later developments in philosophy and architecture and literature and art, okay, that the Romans are going to produce, usually through the use of Greek artisans. But continuing on from there, just underlining those cities in case you can't read them on the map, Pithecusae and Cumae, underlined in the yellow, okay? Now, when we zoom out on the map, we're going to take a look at the entire peninsula, and notice they're kind of color-coded map. You could see three distinct areas that I want you to focus on. Really the green, which were the Greeks that we just looked at, the orange, which is the next group we're going to talk about, which are the Etruscans. Okay, now the Etruscans occupy north-central Italy, a region that is called Etruria. The Greeks refer to these guys as the Tersenoi or the Terhenoi, which is why the sea off the coast on the west side of Italy is called the Tyrrhenian Sea. Now, they didn't call themselves that. The Etruscans seem to have called themselves something closer to the Rosnal. But we get the word Etruscan. Now, the Latin tribes, which are in the center, primarily between the Etruscans and the Greeks in the south, is this little teeny pink territory that I just circled on the map. And these are Indo-European Italic tribes that speak the Latin language. This region is going to be known as Latium or Latium. Okay, again, all related but independent city-states. One of those city-states is going to be the city of Rome. Okay, you can see that also very small on the map where the star is located. It's kind of in the northern portion of Latium. And when we talk about Romans in the ancient world, we're referring to the Latin inhabitants of that particular city-state. Now, that term Roman can be used in a broader sense a little bit later on because as Rome grows into an empire and eventually extends citizenship to people throughout the empire, you can start to use that term of anybody that has been Romanized, adopted the Roman culture, or been given Roman citizenship. But in this early period, we're really talking about just that one little city-state. Okay. Now, I do want to point out a little bit more about the other tribes. Right on the previous map, let me just go back 1 second. You can see that entire yellow section of Italy. This is not one unified culture. What you have in this vicinity are lots of different tribes that we could just refer to as the Italic tribes. Okay. Italy was incredibly fragmented. Now, most of these tribes speak Italic languages. They're all Indo-European for the most part, and some of the names that I've just thrown on the screen are groups like the Sabines, which have a big role to play in very early Roman mythology for the most part. Then you've got the Umbrians, the Aequi, the Volscians, Samnites, which are that brown territory in the center. That's going to be a really difficult area for Rome early to conquer. One of the great enemies, one of the great Italic enemies in Italy for the Romans. Then you've got the Oscans, Lucanians, etc. Okay, you get so many that you'd have to just zoom in on the map and take a look so you could see kind of where they're situated. But we're not going to concern ourselves too much with them, though I will mention the Samnite Wars very briefly in just a little bit. I want to turn my attention more to the Etruscans themselves, because not only do the Greeks have a huge cultural impact on the Romans, so do the Etruscans. Now, the Etruscans I didn't describe as being Indo-European speaking people. As a matter of fact, they weren't. We start to see the emergence of the Etruscans as a distinct group, definitely by the 8th century. We say the Etruscan civilization really begins to flourish, but they do seem to be connected to, like I said, that earlier Villanovan and Proto-Villanovan stage of development, though there's a big debate among scholars and historians as to where the Etruscans originally came from, whether they were indigenous to Italy or whether they came from elsewhere. Now, they themselves are influenced by the Greeks, who they're going to have a lot of contact with. And if you actually look at some of the pictures that I have on the screen, you could see the tomb of the leopards up at the top, which is, you can see the wall painting. Definitely some Greek influence there. Now, we don't have Greek wall painting that has survived to the modern day. We have Greek vase painting, and we know the Greeks produced lots of wall painting as well, but it's gone. So if we want to learn a little bit about what Greek wall painting may have looked like, we can potentially turn to the Etruscan wall paintings, because we have plenty of tombs from Etruria that have wonderful paintings like this in the fresco style. All right, so you can see a little bit about Etruscan life by looking at their tombs, which we may or may not have time to do this semester. Below that is a sarcophagus. I'll get to that in a second, because that has to do with a burial practice that the Etruscans had, which is basically, I might as well talk about it now, the practice of inhumation. Not only did they cremate their dead, but they buried their dead in sarcophagi. Now, the question as to their origins were something that was even speculated by the ancients themselves. Now, were they from the Eastern Mediterranean? That's one particular viewpoint. And things that could lead to that conclusion are not only things mentioned by some ancient historians, but also things that we've seen in the modern archaeological record. So, for instance, if you remember the Sea Peoples, the collapsing Bronze Age around 1150 BC led to, this mass migration of people, potentially Greeks, leaving the Greek mainland after the collapse of the Mycenaean era. Remember, we have Troy, we have all kinds of turmoil in the Near East. And then in Egyptian records, we've got the mention of these Sea Peoples. Among the peoples mentioned as Sea Peoples by Ramesses III are groups like the Teresh. Now, we don't know who half of these groups are. We only speculate on who they may be, but some people have suggested that the Teresh may be the Tyrrhenians, right, the early Etruscan people. So it's possible that they came from the east, and some of the things that lead us also to this conclusion would be some of the things the early historians mention. Thucydides actually ties the Etruscans to kind of a pre-Greek Attic people right there around Athens. If you remember, Attica is where Athens was. That were associated with these Pelasgian groups and even the Lemnian pirates. And I'll mention Lemnos in just a second. Herodotus, the father of history, actually says that the Etruscans were from Lydia in Asia Minor. And that was a view that the Romans and the Etruscans themselves basically accepted. Of course, that wasn't the picture that everybody accepted. And the historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, great Greek historian of the 1st century BC, completely disagreed because he didn't see any similarity between Etruscan culture and what we know of Lydian culture. He rather believed that they were potentially indigenous to Italy. Okay. You also have the theory that they were Luwian people. This is a more modern theory. Luwian people being the people associated with ancient Troy, and it's kind of an interesting theory, though I don't think very many people hold to it, and it's based on the idea that you do have a very big tradition of the Trojans arriving in Italy, and this is actually going to even impact the early legends of the founding of Rome. But today, scholars go back and forth, and like I said, there's no universal consensus. But I think more and more people do think that they were indigenous to the region for various reasons, such as their grave sites were right on top of the earlier Villanovan grave sites, and their cities were right on top of the earlier Villanovan towns. It seems to be maybe an evolution, though you could imagine a mixture of cultures, because there are differences between the Etruscan stage of development with their burial practices and with their art and with their city organization that were definitely different than the earlier Villanovan settlements. So it's possible perhaps that some group from the east came into Italy, perhaps mixing with the local people that were already there and developing some kind of new culture. Again, I'm going to leave that for, some other people to really resolve, okay? One thing I do want to point out is we do have written records from the Etruscans, which is kind of neat. And we do know the language is not Indo-European. It's possibly a pre-Indo-European language we don't really know. And it seems to be related to other languages that we've found evidence of in the ancient world, particularly Rhaetic and Lemnian. So this goes back to that island of Lemnos. On the top, I just brought up a picture of the Kippus Persinus, which is a stela from around the region of Perugia in Italy, which shows an Etruscan script. Below, in that little drawing, is basically a drawing based off a stela, or actually an inscription found on the island of Lemnos. Now, Lemnos was an island in the Aegean, very close to Troy. Has a history and mythology. It's the place where Philoctetes was left on the way to Troy, right? I don't think I went over that story with you guys, but if you ever read Greek mythology, it's a really fun story. Anyways, there's definitely a similarity between the Etruscan and the Lemnian stela, which lends support to the idea that the Etruscans may have come from the east. Of course, it's also possible that the Etruscans maybe planted a colony there when they were at their peak of power a little bit later on. We don't really know. We do know there's some similarity, and it's just kind of interesting. The big drawback with the written records that remain is they're very difficult to decipher. We don't really know fully well the Etruscan language. We do have quite a few records preserved from the ancient Etruscans, and the ancient Romans actually translated some of their documents into Latin back in the day, but the language has been lost, okay? As far as Etruscan power, let's look at their emergence on the scene in Italy. Basically around 700, they start to dominate the region north of the Tiber River. During the 7th century, they start to expand south into the region of Latium, okay? And then down further into the Greek area where they're going to come into conflict with some of these Greek colonies in Campania. We do know that in this time period, they rule Rome. Okay, we're going to look at that in the early Roman legends. But we believe somewhere around the late 7th century, they come to rule. How they come to rule, we can only speculate. But there's also a formation of an alliance among the city-states in Etruria around this time, known as the League of the Etruscan Cities, which was basically 12 independent city-states brought together for basic warfare. Okay. By the time we get to the 6th century, they have made alliances across the sea with Carthage. Their peak starts to wane by the time you get to the middle 6th century. They're in conflict with the Greeks. They actually lose by 506 a lot of the territory that they had gained in the middle. So earlier, like 540 BC, they've defeated the Greeks after they've taken over the island of Corsica. Carthage around this time has actually taken the larger island of Sardinia, just south of Corsica. But around 506, and this is a period that we're going to look at with respect to Roman history in a second, they start to lose control of the region of Latium, and their decline begins. And what happens after that is you still have a presence in the north, maybe even some expansion into the northern territories of Italy. Ultimately, they don't have a resurgence in power. Okay, with their defeat in 474 by the Greeks at Cumae, they're pretty much done as a power, and we're going to now see them become slowly eclipsed by Rome. Okay, and we're going to turn to that in just a second. But this early presence and early power is going to have a big impact. All right, when they conquer Rome and the Latin territories, they're going to leave a mark. So we're going to look at their cultural impact probably next class. Now, I want to turn to the legendary origins of Rome, and when we cover these historical overviews, it's tempting to want to discard the legend and focus purely on what we know about the history. And one of the problems in ancient history is we don't always know very much about the early periods of Roman history, and we have to, or any ancient history, we have to rely a little bit on legend. We have to look at archaeology. We piece these things together, modern historians and archaeologists. But it's worth talking about the legendary origins and legendary stories of a people for its own sake, because it's not only important what happened historically, right? I think the truth of history really does matter, but it's also important to look at what people believed happened historically, the perceived history of a people, because sometimes it's the perceived history of a people that has as much impact on history and the present as the actual history, and sometimes even more of an impact. Okay, so let's take a look at the legendary origins of Rome. We're going to jump all the way back to Troy. Okay, so we're going to go back again to the 12th century BC. The city of Troy has fallen, and the Romans trace themselves back to an exile by the name of Aeneas, prince of Troy, who leaves and finds a new homeland for his people in Italy. Okay, this is going to be the basis of the entire epic poem known as the Aeneid. All right, so this is a story that the Romans believed. It's not something that was made up by the poet Virgil when he wrote the Aeneid. This is something that was believed by ancient Romans for quite some time. Now, does this have anything to do with that period of the Sea People migrations? Possibly. A lot of these stories potentially developed early on during this era. Stories of Odysseus, maybe stories of Jason, all these stories that the Greeks had of wanderings and sea voyages. Does seem to tie back to this era. But the story of Aeneas is the one that's going to be concerning us. And Aeneas and his son Ascanius end up leaving Troy. And here you see some illustrations of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises. Very famous image that you see in not only ancient art, but also into Renaissance and Baroque art a little bit later on, which you can see on the map, not the map, but on the screen. The black figure vase painting at the top being one of the older pieces, obviously. Here's a Greek depiction of Aeneas carrying his father. And that's the standard depiction of Aeneas, kind of a devoted figure, loyal to his ancestors and very devoted as a son, carrying his crippled father out of the city of Troy. The other ancient figurine below that little statuette, and then a more recent sculpture by the Baroque artists. Anyways, he settles in Latium. And this is going to inspire Virgil's Aeneid, which we're going to look at as a class a little bit later. I think one of the groups is going to be doing a presentation on the Aeneid. If you want to hear an entire lecture on the Aeneid, you could look at some of my mythology material, because I cover the Aeneid in some depth in my Myth and Human Culture class. Anyways, Ascanius, his son, is credited with founding a city in Latium known as Alba Longa. And this is going to be the parent city later to Rome. Now, from Alba Longa comes a descendant of Aeneas known as Romulus, and he is going to be the founder of Rome. According to Roman historians prior to Virgil, Naevius, Ennius, these guys working in the 2nd century BC, they have a mention, particularly in Naevius, in his epic poem called the Bellum Punicum, which deals with the Punic War, something we're going to look at very shortly. He talks about the founding of the city of Carthage and its queen Dido. She's going to be very big in the story of Aeneas. The wanderings of Aeneas actually take him to Carthage at one point before he arrives in Italy. But according to these early historians, they describe Romulus, the founder of Rome, as a grandson of Aeneas. Again, the chronology in ancient mythology is usually pretty messed up. Rome was not founded back in the 12th century, so to put him that close to Aeneas is a little bit problematic, and later people realized this issue, and they move him to not just being a grandson, but being a descendant, removed by a number of generations from the founder Aeneas. Now, let's take a look at the famous story of Romulus and Remus, and to show you again to show you how committed I am to my love of ancient Rome. For today, I actually wore my Roma shirt depicting the story of Romulus and Remus on it. Most people don't recognize this as I wear it around. They think it's a Puma shirt, but if you look closely, you could see Romulus and Remus right there under the wolf. So if you've heard the story of Romulus and Remus, you're probably familiar with the she-wolf. So let's talk about how this story unfolds. Okay, so you've got in Alba Longa some palace intrigue, which leads to the overthrow of the legitimate king of the city, a guy by the name of Numitor, by his wicked brother Amulius. Now, Amulius would like to make sure that you don't have anybody coming back to depose him in the future, so that any other rivals for the throne are eliminated. He takes Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, and dedicates her to the goddess Vesta. Now, the priestesses of Vesta were virgins. If you've heard the term Vestal Virgin, this is where it comes from. Now, the idea is, of course, that she is never going to have children. He doesn't have to worry about any future heirs. Now, in the mythology, of course, she is visited by the god Mars, who impregnates her, and she gives birth later to the twin boys, Romulus and Remus. And in this visual here, you can see the famous bronze she-wolf, which many people believe was an ancient Etruscan sculpture. The figurines of Romulus and Remus beneath the wolf were added during the Renaissance. There's actually some debate today about whether or not this actually is an Etruscan sculpture. Some people now think it dates to the Middle Ages. But again, it's a very cool thing. This is actually in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. So if you ever go to the city of Rome, one of my favorite museums is the Capitoline Museum, where you have this piece as well as a number of other really magnificent pieces. Anyways, the two boys are born. They're sent by their uncle to be abandoned in the wilderness to die. The practice of exposure, infanticide, a way to get rid of unwanted children, is fairly widespread in the ancient world. But they're put into a basket, brought down to the Tiber River, and abandoned, but found by a she-wolf who had just given birth to a litter of pups and was able to nurse the children and keep them alive long enough for a shepherd by the name of Faustulus to find them, raise them, and they grow into young men who are fairly strong as shepherds, and they eventually find out about their grandfather Numitor, put him back on the throne, and kind of get rid of their evil uncle. Okay, so you've got a little bit of a story there. But they don't settle down back in their hometown of Alba Longa. They actually move on to the site which is going to be Rome. So we could talk about the mythical founding of the city. So here's a map which shows you the famous 7 hills. If you've ever heard of Rome, it's sometimes referred to as the Eternal City. A lot of times it's referred to as the city on the 7 hills. So here are the 7 hills. And you notice in the middle, you have one hill that's known as the Palatine Hill. This is where Romulus apparently built the early settlement that was going to become later Rome, named after him. And he builds on the morning of April 21st at 8 a.m. in the year 753, a very small wall around that settlement. Wasn't much of a settlement yet. The archaeology, by the way, does show settlement on the Palatine Hill going back to this time period, potentially a little bit earlier. Anyways, the way the story unfolds, and this, by the way, is what the city may have looked like in its early phase, these rudimentary huts, very, very primitive. Not what you would call a city, because at this point, it's just a little village, if that. The story is that his brother, Remus, starts to mock these small, teeny walls around the Palatine Hill and decides to jump over the walls to make fun of his brother. And as he's laughing at his brother Romulus, in his anger, turns around and stabs Remus, killing him on the spot. Now, this story is kind of a ending, sad ending for the two brothers, but is in a way for Rome a warning myth. The idea being, I think, that those who jump over the wall, right, those who don't come into the city the right way, which is through the gate, are not friends but enemies. And this is kind of the story of what will happen to the enemies of Rome. Those people that try to come over our walls, this is the fate that's in store for you as well. So it kind of fits with the Roman mentality. And we'll kind of see later the idea of really protecting Rome and how this works out with the actual building of Rome's early walls a little bit later. But when was Rome founded? The date of 753 is the traditional date that we have. And this is something the ancients themselves wrestled with. This is not just something that modern historians try to figure out. If you go all the way back to Timaeus, which is a Greek historian, he tried to date the city of Rome's founding, dated it around 814 BC. And he dated it, remember, by the convenient dating method was to compare events to the Olympiads. If you remember when we talked about Greek dating systems, they would date things according to these cycles known as the Olympics, these 4-year cycles. And he dated the founding of Rome 38 years prior to the very first Olympiad, and if you remember that, was in 776 BC, which would put Rome's founding at 814. Now, the date jumps around from historian to historian. The early Roman historian Quintus Fabius Pictor dates it to around 748, which is really close to the traditional date that we have, and he dates it to the first year of the 8th Olympiad. Dionysius of Halicarnassus moves it further forward to 751, but eventually they arrive at what's called the Varronian chronology, based on Marcus Terentius Varro in the 1st century BC. The date is essentially fixed at 753. Now, the Romans had ways of dating things as well. They would use the Greek system of comparing things to the Olympiad, but they would also date things according to political officials known as the consuls, or they would date things to with respect to the founding of the city. So 753 in the Roman calendar would be year 1, okay, AUC, which means ab urbe condita, meaning from the founding of the city. All right, so that is the a date that they are going to use. The Palilia festival, by the way, is a festival that was celebrated on April 21st, which coincides with the commemoration of the founding of the city. Okay, by the 4th century AD, Eutropius, he dates it to the exact same time, again, according to the Olympiad, the 3rd year of the 6th Olympiad. But that's basically the time that we accept. And that's where we're going to begin, in a way, early Rome. Now, the last story that I'm going to give you as far as the early founding of the city, I know I'm going off on these legendary stories, but they're kind of fun and interesting. And if you don't know, the Romans were very interested in mythology with respect to their founding, with respect to the early histories, with respect to the early kings and heroes of Rome. They weren't that interested in coming up with stories of their gods. They would turn to the Greeks for that stuff. So anytime they told a story about the gods, it was generally an adaptation from a Greek story where they would plug in a Roman god in the place of a Greek god. The really authentic Roman mythology has to do with these guys, these kings and heroes. And here you have the founding of a city, Romulus, the first king, but you don't have much of a city. As a matter of fact, at the time, it was a city completely made up of men. And these men were brigands. These were people that were exiles from other cities around the region that had come to Rome at the invitation of Romulus to settle down. Now, a city's not going to last very long if you don't have women. So Romulus decides he's going to set out an offer for people to send their daughters to marry these new Roman men. But nobody wants to do this because these are, undesirable people. These are criminals. These are exiles. These are people with a shady reputation. So they decide not to take Romulus up on his offer. So Romulus has to turn to some other method to gather women into the society. And what he does is he sets up a religious festival and invites the people from the surrounding tribes to come to Rome to worship the gods. And again, not only would it be a religious activity that would be attractive to the, religious people of the era, but a festival, which would be, a celebration. So along come all these people visiting the town of Rome for this religious festival, and Romulus had set up a trap, really, where he sends the Roman guys into hiding around various places in the city, and when he gives the signal, they would rush from their hiding places and abduct the women, steal them away from their dads, and marry them in secret. This is called the rape of the Sabine women. Which leads to a conflict with the group of people that were there, which are the Sabine tribe. I already mentioned that the Sabines were one of the Italic tribes of central Italy. Anyways, this war eventually is stopped, the fathers versus the husbands. It's the women that say, we need to call it quits. We've got our new husbands, we've got our fathers. We don't want to have this fighting amongst everybody. And a peace is declared. And to share power with the king Romulus, you've got the Sabine king Titus Tatius. And they share power as almost like a diarchy, very similar to ancient Sparta. Now, again, this is legend. We don't know that Rome ever had two kings. It seems to be maybe an anachronistic element that has crept into the legend based on the fact that the Romans would later, during the Republic, have two lead political officials known as consuls that ruled. But we'll get to that just shortly. Anyways, this is the beginning of the monarchy. And the monarchy, according to tradition, lasts from 753 to 509 BC and was a group of only 7 individuals. The first king being Romulus, along for a while with Titus Tatius, the Sabine king. Now, Romulus was a man of war. He's the founder of the city. The tradition is that he was deified. He actually was taken from the earth. He never died. He ascended into heaven. Again, there's different versions of that story, but he ultimately is deified as a god after his death. Okay, and that's kind of important. The Romans never worshipped kings on earth as gods, but they would worship the spirits of the deceased very often. And we'll talk about that later when we get to Roman religion. The second king, a guy by the name of Numa Pompilius, is an important figure because he brings the social customs. He establishes the laws and the religious traditions of Rome, because you can't have a city that's based completely on warfare. You have to have some kind of peaceful tradition that's going to solidify the community, and that's what's given to Numa to his credit. Okay, so 715 or so to 673, and again, these are all traditional dates. Most historians don't accept these. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, just like his name indicates, he was kind of a man of war. Apparently was struck by lightning, killed by the gods at the end of his life. And then the last of the Latin kings was a guy by the name of Ancus Marcius, okay, about 642 to 617. And he was credited with founding the port of Rome down the Tiber River, right at the west coast of Italy, a town by the name of Ostia. Okay, it's going to be Rome's port city. After these four Latin monarchs, you move into a period of Etruscan domination. Now, the story is that the Etruscans don't conquer Rome, but you have an election of a king, a guy by the name of Tarquinius Priscus, who is an immigrant to Rome. He's only half Etruscan, by the way, according to the stories, and half Greek, moves there, and then is later elected. Now, the idea of electing a king might be also anachronistic, because the Roman government after the period of the monarchy does just that, elects their leaders. Kings are not normally elected, they're usually hereditary. So again, these legends are something that are developed in an oral tradition much later on. But he's the first Etruscan. He is credited with bringing a couple things to the city, like the Cloaca Maxima, which is the great sewer system. I showed you the 7 hills of Rome. Those were the high points in Rome where the early settlement was. The lowland around those hills was at the time kind of swampy. You couldn't do very much with that territory. And apparently it was after the building of this great drainage system that emptied into the Tiber River that you could actually start to build down in the lowlands. And you're going to have the development of the Roman Forum, which is the center of city. You're going to have the Capitolium built. This is the major temple on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and the Circus Maximus, all to the Etruscan contribution. And the Etruscans probably did have a lot to do with the early urbanization of this village as it grows into an actual city. The next king, Servius Tullius, is credited with building the first walls of Rome. Actually, the walls that are called the Servian walls, we'll look at a little bit later, those date to the 4th century. So again, a little bit of an error in the Roman history, but he's credited with building the early walls. And then the final Etruscan king, the 7th king altogether, was a guy by the name of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, a very arrogant and cruel man. And because of his personality and other flaws in his family, you're going to have the kings ousted in 509. So let's turn our attention to the revolution with the expulsion of the kings. It's based on another story of rape. In this case, it's the rape of a noble woman by the name of Lucretia. Now, she was married to a guy by the name of Tarquinius Collatinus, so obviously a relative of Tarquin. Now, Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia. Lucretia afterward tells her husband and other relatives about this offense, and then in her grief commits suicide. The husband, along with Lucius Junius Brutus, puts together a revolt against the king. They kick out Tarquin and institute in its place a republic, a new type of government wanting to abolish kingship altogether. All right, so the name Lucius Junius Brutus is the big name when it comes to the founding of the Roman Republic. And I want you to remember the name Brutus, because that family name is going to come back later in Roman history at a particularly important time with an apparent rise of kingship once again in the late Republic. But I'm going to hold off on that till our next session. Now, what happens with the Republic is you have, in place of the kings, a consul, actually 2 consuls. And we'll look at the Roman government in just a second, the Republican system. But according to the the Veronian chronology, this would have been in year 245 AUC, or 509 BC. That's a bust of potentially Brutus. We don't really know, but a lot of people say that's the bust of Brutus. It's a wonderful statue, I think. Anyways, the Republic is going to last for 500 years approximately. And then it's going to collapse. The Roman Republic, by the way, is going to be the government that is in many ways a model for the government of the United States. When the founding fathers of America sat down to decide what type of system they were going to have, they not only drew from the tradition back in Britain, right? They also drew from ancient Rome and ancient Greece and the political philosophers, which go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Now, of course, they're going to make modifications on the Roman Republican system, but they picked a Republican system because it was designed to have certain checks and balances, right? To share power so that you don't have any one branch or one individual coming to dominate the state. Now, it was an effective system. Like I said, it lasted in Rome for about 500 years. It had its flaws. And the system that the founding fathers have, modified things to try to avoid some of those same flaws, and I think they did come up with a better system. Of course, it has not yet stood the test of time. We'll see how it does. Now, the Roman Republic was built of the consuls. Let's look at the consuls first. This is the 2 annual elected magistrates at the top. They're basically your executive branch of the government, and they hold office for a single year. Not long enough to gain too much power, and the fact that there are 2 of these mean they have to share power. No one powerful individual can come to dominate the state. The main power that these guys are given by the government was known as imperium. This is actually where we get the word empire from. The power itself is just the authority to command the army. So the consuls are essentially your civilian generals, right, over the state, right? The commanders in chief, right? This is the same role that the President of the United States today has, commander-in-chief, a civilian officer in command of the military. Now, the Romans, by the way, didn't have a professional military early on. That's something that's going to develop much later. But you have those consuls. The next branch of the government we'll call the Senate. Now, the Senate originally was an advisory body to the consuls, possibly earlier to the kings. Okay, it seems to be going back even further. The Senatus was a patrician body for the most part, and the patricians were the upper class for the most part. They derive their name from the word for the father, the pater. So they were like the fathers of the state. And the Senatus basically gets its name as the older men, right? The seniors, the wise men that were in a position to advise. They eventually evolve into a deliberative and legislative body over time, and it generally is a body of about 300 members that serve for life. And they could actually institute things called senatus consulta, which were not official laws, but carried sometimes the weight or authority of a law. Okay? The office by 133 BC is open to ex-office holders only, okay, after a vacancy emerges. But they're going to be really important, and there's going to be kind of a struggle between the Senate and various generals in the late Republic that's ultimately going to lead to the collapse of Rome, though the Senate will continue on long after the Republic is over. The last group are the assemblies. So let's take a look at what the assemblies were. These were the voting citizens. All right, it's a body of citizens, and they could be organized by birth, class, or residence. So there are different types of assemblies that could be gathered together for voting purposes, depending on the types of things you're voting on. So the Comitia Curiata, which is an early assembly, apparently existing during the monarchy, this is according to tradition, elected the kings, was divided into 30 groups or curia. And later this particular assembly would ratify the election of consuls and officially give the consuls their power of imperium. But the more important assemblies were the next 2 that I'm going to look at. The Comitia Centuriata, or the Assembly of the Centuries. They would vote on consular legislation. They would be instrumental in declaring war, and they would also elect the high magistracies, like the consuls themselves, the praetors and censors. And there were 193 centuries or groups, which you can consider voting blocks, that would be divided by class. I'm going to look at that on the next slide, so I'm going to come back to that, but I'll show you how this works in just a second. So that's the major assembly. Then you also have the tribal assembly, or the Comitia Tributa. Here you have an assembly based on residence and tribe, and they would elect the lower magistracies like quaestors, aediles, military tribunes, and they were organized into basically 33 groups, 4 from the city and 31 from the countryside or the rural areas of Rome, about Rome. Okay, there was a subset of the Comitia Tributa. It's not technically an assembly of the state, but assembly of the plebs, because it's called the concilium plebis. The plebs are the lower classes, to distinguish them from the patricians, and we're going to see an interaction between those groups very shortly. But this particular version of the assembly was only limited to those lower classes. They could elect their own tribunes. They could vote on their own laws called plebiscites, and we'll look at that in a little bit. So it's kind of complicated, but to show you how complicated and how this might work, let's look at the Comitia Centuriata in particular. This particular assembly was for, like I said, the election of the consuls and the declaration of war, and it was based on these groups known as centuries. And the word century literally refers to a group of 100, though these are never really groups of 100 people. They're all different size groups. And this is how it was kind of arranged. If you look at the schematic on the screen, you could see different size circles. Those circles are going to represent a century. Each circle a different century. Now, there were, in total, like I said, 193 of these groupings based on class. In the blue, we'll call those the patrician centuries, and the red, we'll call those the plebeian or lower class centuries. The patricians had 98 groups, okay? And each group gets a single vote in the election of a consul or something like that, okay? The plebeians have 95 groups, fewer in number, which tells you the patricians have the majority vote in any vote or election. The plebeians have a minority. They would usually start a vote with the patrician upper class first and work your way down to the lower classes. So if the patricians reach a majority vote, which often they did, then the plebeians would not ever need to vote at all because it wouldn't make a difference. They don't have enough votes to overrule the patricians. Now notice the patricians are very small groups. They're a minority of the population. They're about 10% of the Roman population, while the plebeians make up about 90% of the Roman population. So 10% ultimately control things because they have smaller groups with more votes rather than larger groups with fewer votes. So it's not really a fair system, and this is ultimately going to lead to the patrician domination of the state very early on. And we'll take a look at the struggles for equality in Rome in a little while. First, I'm going to turn to some external threats. Now, with Rome expelling the kings, the story is that the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, decides to get some support to be put back on the throne of Rome, and he goes back to the Etruscan cities in the north to help him do this. Apparently, he fights to take Rome with the help of the city of Veii and Tarquinii and fails to do this, and then later turns to the city of CLUSIUM, whose leader, Lars Porsena, marches on Rome. And the story is he offers aid to, put Tarquinius Superbus back on the throne. There doesn't seem to be any indication that this actually happened historically. But there was possibly the attempt by CLUSIUM to come and conquer Rome early on. So let's say around 508 BC. Now, there are two versions of this story that come down to us. The first story is that Porsena fails to take the city due to the heroism of some of the early Roman champions. The famous story of Horatius Cocles, which is Horatio at the bridge. The Pons Sublicius is this bridge outside the city of Rome, and the Romans, to defend against the army of CLUSIUM, have Horatio and I think a couple others, but Horatio primarily by himself, standing guard on this bridge and fighting, against the entire army on this little narrow passageway while the Romans dismantle the bridges and block the army from crossing. And here's Horatio fighting, and as long as it takes for that bridge to be dismantled, and at the very end he dives into the river and swims to safety on the other side. So this idea of Romans standing up against all odds. Those are the types of stories that the Romans loved, and it really does indicate a little bit of Roman personality. As we look at early Roman war, we're going to see sometimes the underdog story that emerges in Roman history, but definitely the story of fortitude, endurance, the ability to stick with it in the face of all odds. Another story that's kind of fun is the story of Mucius Caevola, who was an assassin sent to kill Lars Porsena, breaks into Lars Porsena's tent. He fails to actually assassinate the king and is caught and about to be executed. And Scaevola, which means lefty, because he sticks his left hand into the fire right in front of Lars Porsena, showing the willingness to be tortured and die for the sake of getting at the king and saving the Roman state. And Porsena is supposedly so afraid of this Roman attitude and the fact that there will be many more to rise up, even if he's put to death. Scaevola, if you kill him, there'll be many other people that, come out to try to assassinate you. Apparently leads Porsena to abandoning his attempts at taking over Rome. Of course, the other version that comes down to us from Tacitus is that he does take the city and bans the use of weaponry, does not restore Tarquin to the throne, but rules for a brief time himself. Now, don't know which story is true. Most likely Tacitus's version is, but either way, you've got two different accounts. And that's one of the problems with these early stories. They're all based on oral tradition that has been passed down to much later writers. Tacitus, a little bit later, Livy writing in the 1st century BC. Anyways, the story continues with Porsena's son Arruns, who lays siege to the Latin city of Aricia. A battle of Aricia in 506 is where the Greeks come to the aid of the Latins. Aristodemus, the leader of the Greek city of Cumae, sends forces to assist the Latins to fight off the Etruscans, and they defeat the Etruscans. Now, this whole idea of Greek involvement in the early history of Rome is kind of important. The Greeks, again, culturally are going to have a big impact on the Latins, but the idea of liberating the area of Latium would have been in the interest of the Greeks, if you think about it, because the Greeks have already been in conflict with the Etruscans, who had been pushed down into that territory in the earlier centuries. For Greek security, it would be really nice to have a buffer zone between the Etruscans and the Greeks of the south, and that would be nicely done by a liberated and free Latium. Okay, so Aristodemus does that. Now, supposedly, Aristodemus then shelters later the king Tarquin, who apparently dies in exile at the city of Cumae in 496, bringing an end to the potential of monarchy ever resurging, coming back in Rome altogether. Now, that wasn't the only threat, right? This idea of Etruscans wanting to reconquer Latium. The other threat to early Rome would have been the Latins themselves. Now, the Latin city-states had an alliance just like the Etruscan city-states did. This was called the Latin League and dated all the way back to the time of the kings. It was based on possibly the leadership of the early city of Alba Longa, but the idea of a league, again, for mutual protection, right? If you want to remain liberated, if you want to remain free, it's probably important for these Latin city-states to gather together and to form some type of opposition to potential further incursion by the Etruscans or anybody else who was a threat to the region. Now, there's a conflict that emerges within the League. Now, one of the traditions, again, is that this king Tarquin the Proud wanted to unite the Latins against Rome, potentially to become king one more time. Now, what's more likely is that Rome was beginning to assert its authority over the League, maybe pushing its weight around, maybe an early attempt at becoming the dominant city-state. Whatever happens is the League fights against Rome. So it's Rome versus the Latin League. Now, the city of Tusculum actually isolates Rome by cutting off trade, and this ultimately leads to a physical conflict at the Battle of Lake Regillus in 496. Now, the Roman account is that they invade the Tusculan territory, and in the midst of this battle, these mythical heroes, Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, right, these are the brothers of Helen of Troy, by the way, show up on the battlefield and lead to a Roman victory. Now, we can question whether there was actually a Roman victory, but most likely realizing the need for putting their differences aside and maintaining an alliance because of other threats like the tribes in the hills, ultimately they stop fighting. And in 493, they sign what's called the Foedus Cassianum, which is apparently an early treaty, a peace treaty between Rome and the League, which ends the war. And this League is maintained for a long time afterward. There's ultimately going to be a Latin war between 343 and 338. And that's essentially going to end the Latin League and come to really the domination of Rome. But for the most part, they maintain this league. And the Latins, of course, are always going to be very, very close with the Romans. Now, that's early external problems. we turn our attention to what's going on in the city of Rome, we see that there's another issue that's going to take a long time to resolve, and this is a social conflict. This is basically an equal rights movement that breaks out into Rome in the 5th century. So let's talk about social distancing, old-fashioned style. Let's look at the patricians and the plebeians. These are the two classes that I already mentioned. So to, again, refresh your memory as to what they are, patricians are the upper class. These are the powerful families, about 1/10 of the population, and they monopolized the offices, the government, the Senate for the early period. And again, the word patrician comes from the word pater, or father, and that was the head of a household. And if you don't know anything about Roman families, the pater was really all powerful within the household. They even had the power of life and death, over their children, which seems really extreme, but that was ancient Rome. Right? It wasn't just about corporal punishment with your children. You can't just spank them. They actually had capital punishment powers. Right? If you want to execute your child for disobedience, you had the ability to do that. I don't think it was done all that often, but you do have some stories in Roman history where it's done. Anyways, you can kind of think of the patricians as in that position, leadership over the entire state. The plebeians, on the other hand, are the lower class families. And this is not based on wealth. You don't want to think upper class, lower class as wealthy and then the poor. The plebeians could be very wealthy individuals. What makes you plebeian is your heredity, what your family is, right? Your family name. So this is by birth, not by wealth. They lacked legal protections. They lacked political power. And what they're going to do is they're going to realize, being the majority of the population, they have power, more power than you think. And what they're going to do is slowly gain equality over time. Now, the picture that we get of patricians dominating the state is a traditional picture, that there was inequality from the very outset of ancient Rome, and then it was going to be followed by 200 years of a civil rights struggle. The evidence, however, is actually to the contrary. It does seem to be indication, by looking at lists of early consuls and the names of some of these individuals, that about 1/3 of those consuls prior to 450 happened to be plebeian, which seems to indicate that the plebeians at one time did share power with the patricians. For instance, Lucius Junius Brutus, the guy who founded the Republic altogether, the name Unia, gens Unia, which is the family name there, all the people from that family in Roman history that we know of were plebeians. Now, I don't know if they're possibly patrician earlier on, but there's every indication that here's the very first consul of Rome, very well may have been plebeian himself. Spurius Cassius, one of the famous early consuls, he's the one who signed the Foedus Cassianum, it's actually named after him, was consul for 3 times, 3 separate consulships in 502, 493, and then 486, again, very early in history. Now, of course, Spurius Cassius, according to the tradition, ends up losing his life and is executed. That's actually the visual that you see here, which is a Renaissance painting of the decapitation of Spurius Cassius when the population ultimately turned against him. But what may have happened is due to, the way the patricians were able to dominate elections, maybe they rose to power and began to isolate the plebeian classes. And the plebeians eventually lost the power to hold consulship, etc. So what happens is we end up with what's called the conflict of the orders, the civil rights movement. And it begins really as a workers' strike. So look at it this way. Around 494, you've got what's called the first secession. Secession is when you break off from the state. Now, the plebeians realize, these are again the lower class families by birth. They would include small landholders, sometimes some wealthy individuals, artisans, farm workers, peasants that were abused by the patricians, sometimes even put into debt slavery, those that were not more wealthy. And they realized, since we're 90% of the population, we basically run Rome. We fight. We're the majority of the army. We are the ones conducting the majority of the business. And if we walked out of the city of Rome, what were the patricians to do? And they do this. They retreat to the sacred mount on the river Anio, which is about 3 miles from Rome, and basically encamp there and say, we're going to farm our own city-state if you don't make some concessions, which the patricians do. They grant to them the concilium plebis, the council, right, the plebeian council that we talked about before, and they grant to them the tribunate, the tribune of the plebs, which is a magistracy for the defense of the plebeians. And they're usually at least 2 tribunes, sometimes upward of 12 or 15 of these guys, depending on the period of time in Roman history that we're talking. And they're given a power that's known as the veto, which the Latin verb for I forbid. So the idea of the veto, which we still have today, this is a power that the President of the United States has. The veto power is the power to basically stop legislation. So if they saw the Senate or the magistrates doing something that would be harmful to the lower classes, they could step in, shut it down. Okay, that's a very important power to have. That was right in the beginning of this movement. But it's 200 years before they're ever given any kind of equality. So let's look at some of the highlights among these 200 years. In 471, the concilium plebis is made constitutional. This is that assembly. And they have the ability to pass laws known as plebiscites or plebiscites with Senate confirmation. And these would be binding only on the lower classes. These wouldn't be laws for the entire state, but they could at least pass their own laws by 471. Around 450, middle of the 5th century, you have the codification of laws known as the 12 Tables. And these are going to protect the Romans or the plebeians against arbitrary judgment, abuse of power. It gives them the right to appeal. It gives, unfortunately, a abolishment of intermarriage. So within these laws, Tablet 11 actually deals with marriage rules and says, we can't marry in between the patricians and plebeians. This was apparently already going on. But I guess to keep the two groups completely distinct, this was put into the codified laws at that time. The very next year, you've got another group of laws that are passed called the Valerio-Horatian laws. After the second time, the plebeians decide to secede. And here, the tribune, which was given back in 494, is given what's called sacrosanctity. Sacrosanctity is the idea that you're made inviolable, sacred, with the idea that you can't be harmed. Nobody can assault one of these guys. Again, they're probably intimidation used. If you want to prevent a tribune from using his veto power, you could threaten violence. You could actually, physically remove the person from the Senate House or something like that. So to stop this from happening, they're given sacrosanctity. So if you harm a tribune, this was a religious crime. This is something the gods would punish, and that's pretty serious from the Roman point of view, being very religious people. And they also make these plebiscites binding on all of the population by that time, as long as the Senate ratifies that vote. Okay? By 445, intermarriage is changed. So within a 5-year period, they go back to allowing intermarriage between the groups. And then the next stage, the lex licinius sextia, lex is the Latin word for law. 367, the consulship is finally opened to plebeians, and Lucius Sextius Lateranus is the first plebeian council in the year 366, the very next year. Okay. By the time we get to 342, the lex Genucia law is passed, making it the case that one out of the two consuls needs to be plebeian. Okay, or at least that's the belief. Okay, so then you have to have a shared power between patricians and plebeians from that time forward. 339, the lex Publilia makes those plebiscites binding on all the people as long as you have Senate pre-approval before the vote. And then in 287, the lex Hortensia, which is after the very last secession, you have the plebiscites carrying full weight of the law without Senate ratification. Basically, they're full-fledged laws. And at this point, you ultimately have equality, right? So for 200 years, a struggle for equality that eventually does manifest. And after that, it really doesn't matter. Plebeian, patrician, they have all the same rights, all the same privileges, all the same powers for the most part, and are really designated just by, your family name. And that even becomes blurry since you can have intermarriage between these groups since 445. Okay, but that's the conflict of the orders. Equality is something that people fight for, and it sometimes takes a long time to obtain. Around the same time, while they're going through this development within the social structure of Rome, you have the beginning of an empire. And when we look at the early conquest, again, like all conquests, it begins close to home. And it's going to begin with conflict with the Etruscans. The city of Veii was the closest Etruscan town to Rome. And that particular city, which is located right here on the map, was just across the Tiber River from Rome, but controlled territory on Rome's side of the river, particularly the town of Fidenae. The Romans, right there is Fidenae, the Romans in 479 attack the city and try to liberate it from Etruscan control, and they fail to do this. And this is the beginning of an ongoing conflict that lasts for the better part of a century with the one little town of Veii. 426 is a conflict between the Romans and the people from Veii, where the Roman commander apparently actually kills the king of Veii personally on the battlefield, Tolumnius, executed by the Roman commander Cossus. But the final event in this conflict is in 405 or thereabouts. This is the siege of the city of Veii. Veii was situated up high on a hill and was easy to defend against an assault. And according to the Roman tradition, this is a 10-year siege, a 10-year war with Veii, kind of in the mode of the Trojan War. Most people don't believe it would take anywhere near 10 years to take the city like that, but that's the story. All good wars should be 10 years if they're going to be epic battles. The Etruscan League doesn't aid Veii, with the exception of the city of Tarquinii, but ultimately by 396, Veii falls, thanks to the commander Camillus, the Roman commander Camillus, who completes the siege, massacres the population, enslaves the survivors, and then at the site of Veii, you have a Roman settlement established, kind of a Roman outpost. That's, I can say, our first external conquest. This is the beginning of the Roman Empire, and it's a very small empire. And it preceded the original setback to the growing Roman Empire, and that's going to be at the hands of a new group who I'm going to introduce into the story, which are the Gauls. Now, it was not long after the conquest of Veii that you have these Gauls come down into Italy and present a very serious threat to Rome. Now, originally these are Celtic tribes. I talked about the Gauls with respect to the Hellenistic world earlier as they moved into Greece in the 3rd century BC. In the 4th century BC, they're doing the same thing in Italy. Now, these migrations have come across the Alps. Northern Italy primarily was already dominated by Gauls, probably going back quite a way. The Romans refer to that territory of northern Italy as Cisalpine Gaul, meaning Gaul this side of the Alps. And various cities around this time were being taken by the Gauls as they were pushing down further and further into Etruscan territory. As an example of this, the famous city that's going to be known as Bononia is an Etruscan city of Felsina that was conquered by a Celtic tribe known as the Boii. That is, Bononia is ultimately going to grow into the later city of Bologna, Italy. That was around 350 BC. But prior to this, as they're coming down, the Etruscan cities need some help. Surprisingly, they're going to turn to Rome. In 391, the Senonian tribe invades Etruria under the command of a guy by the name of Brennus, attacks the city of CLUSIUM, and again, the League of Etruscan Cities does not help the city of CLUSIUM, so they appeal to Rome, a former enemy now needed for assistance. The Senate sends a warning to the Gauls, which is not heeded, and then the Senate ultimately sends an army. And the battle takes place in 390, according to some accounts, at the Battle of Allia, which is a little river. And the Roman-Latin combined force, which engages the Gauls, is massacred. These Gauls are bigger. These Gauls are scary. These Gauls are going to be one of the arch enemies of the early Romans, and they rout the Roman army into the river. And very few survive. A few that are able to get away take refuge up in the ruins of Veii. Some of them make their way down to Rome to warn the city that the Gauls are on the way. And luckily, the Gauls didn't progress directly to Rome. They actually take their time, allowing the Romans in Rome to fortify the Capitoline Hill to withstand a siege. When the Gauls do arrive, apparently there's a 7-month siege of that particular hill, after which they eventually surrender. And the Gauls have them ransom themselves by giving whatever money that they can come up with, compile all the gold you can get and give it to the Gauls. Now the story is that the Roman commander Brennus had the scales set up, and as the Romans were paying the money for their freedom, the Romans began to complain that the scales were not fair. They were weighted incorrectly. And Brennus responds to this by throwing his sword on the one side of the scales and claiming, "Vae victis," which is Latin for "woe to the defeated." Basically, too bad for you, right? You're on the losing side. You don't really get to say how much you have to pay. Now, the Romans also have a tradition that says shortly after this, the former great general Camillus, who had been in voluntary exile from Rome, at this time has built for himself a private army at Veii and marches on the city and decides to liberate Rome not by gold, but by iron. And he says we're going to pay basically the iron price, and then ends up driving the Gauls from the city and saving the city. Again, whether this happened, we don't really know. Most likely the Gauls sacked the city, pillaged, and then left. But this is a traumatic moment in early Roman history, and it's worth talking about a theory as to how Rome began its ultimate expansion. With Veii, right, it's a neighboring city, it was viewed as a threat. The Etruscans have conquered Rome in the past. Now, Roman expansion, according to some, is kind of an accidental happening, right? Kind of a piecemeal building of an empire through what might be termed defensive imperialism. So let me introduce that term into the picture. This is just, again, one theory as to how Rome built its empire. But the Romans, after the sack of their city, viewed the world obviously as a dangerous place, right? You've got these enemies out there that can potentially take out your capital city. If the Gauls wanted to, they could have ended Rome right there. Luckily, they did not. And the Romans tend to view the world as, at least the people out there in the world, as either friends or enemies. There's no such thing as a neutral third party. If you're not an ally, if you're not a friend, you're a potential threat to Rome. And they come up with this justification really for expansion based on the idea of defending themselves. If you build an empire and you get yourself some kind of security as your borders are pushed further and further from your capital city, it's almost like you surround yourself with a buffer zone of protection and allies and subjects. Okay, and in a way, this is related to what we might call a just war theory, which is, just war theory eventually is going to be developed among early Christian theologians and philosophers, particularly at the late Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages. But the Romans themselves had some sense of the idea that war needed to be justified somehow. Okay, so this idea of expanding accidentally really for protection sometimes was a way to view this. It was also at this time that they began to actually fortify the city, right? In response to the fact that you just had your city taken, they're going to make sure that the city is never going to fall again, if they can help it, by building the Servian walls. Now, very little remains of these early walls of Rome. If you go to Rome today, you can see some portions of these walls that survive. This particular section of the wall, which is a larger section, is actually right outside the great train station in the city of Rome. You can see how big this wall was, big, solid blocks of stone. These walls will eventually be abandoned as Rome grows and grows. You're going to have other walls built later on, but this was the early wall around the city of Rome. And it's successful because the Romans are not going to be attacked, at least the city is not going to be sacked or pillaged or even taken for another 800 years. The Romans are going to be able to hold out foreign enemies fairly securely. Okay, now Rome does begin to expand after this period. Right there in the 4th century, you have the beginning of the Samnite Wars. I'm not going to say very much about the Samnite Wars, but I do want to talk about that with respect to the development of the Roman military. You've got 3 Samnite Wars, 343 to 41, 326 to 304, and then 298 to 90. Okay. Ultimately, the Romans are going to come to dominate the region of Samnium, but it was a long, hard battle, and the Romans needed to adapt their military to do this. And they basically restructured their military after the Samnite model. Now, earlier, the Roman army was based on the Greek style of warfare, the phalanx system, right? If you remember the phalanx that the Greeks were using all the way back at Marathon and all the great early battles, where you have the large shields overlapping kind of a wall of soldiers that would push forward using the thrusting spear as their main weapon. That didn't work so well against the Samnites. And what they ended up doing is forming, during the Samnite times, the army of the Middle Republic, and that's going to last from the Samnite period until the Marian reforms a little bit later. This is called the Polybian or Manipular Legion. Now, the maniple was a small unit of about 120 men, and these would be independent units. They could form a line, a wall, like a phalanx, but they were also maneuverable, right? In other words, you can manipulate the line, which would be good on different types of terrain, right? If you're on hilly ground, it's hard to hold a cohesive line. But if you break down into smaller units that are commanded by, small, commanders, you can move around a little bit easier and then reform these lines. So the manipular legion is going to be really, really effective. And then the maniples would form cohorts, which are basically groups of 4 maniples, and then they would be made up of 3 basic rows of different types of warriors: the hastatii in the front, the principes, and then the triarii. The names being the spear bearers, the mainliners, and the thirds. Now, the names don't really mean anything during this period. This kind of refers to earlier designations. But they're equipped with chainmail. The main weapon is a short sword called the gladius. And then their other weapon is what's called the pilum, which is a javelin. Okay? That basically replaces the spear. The only group that holds the spear is the last line, the triarii. Now I'm going to show you how this is going to become really useful in a second when we get to the Punic Wars. Okay, but that's the new development. And here you see some illustrations of what the Roman soldiers of the era may have looked like. They have long, curved shields that give you a great deal of protection. About 283, they start to consolidate their power in the north. They drive out the Senones. They defeat the Etruscans and the Boii at the Battle of Lake Vadimon, and they are eventually taking all of Italy. Now, the last portion of Italy in the south is going to bring about what's called the Punic War. So here's where we're actually going to turn into looking at the military in the context of fighting a Macedonian army. What happens, and if you remember back to our discussion of the Hellenistic period, we saw Pyrrhus fight the Romans in southern Italy. And let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail now. From 280 to 275, you've got a war with Pyrrhus. Now, Pyrrhus was from Epirus. He was the king of Epirus. He's basically a relative, cousin or whatnot of Alexander the Great. Remember, his mother, Olympia, was from Epirus. She was an Epirian princess. What happens is Rome is pushing down into the Greek territories of the south. They have a conflict with the city of Tarentum. And Tarentum has sunk some Roman ships, war is declared, and then Tarentum asks for Pyrrhus to come to the aid. And on the map, I know it's a little bit dark, but you can see how close Epirus is to the end of Italy, the tip of Italy down there. So Epirus sends troops under the king to Tarentum. He invades Italy, and what he is fighting in is what's called the Macedonian-style phalanx. And he also has elephants with him, which is unusual for the Romans to encounter. They're going to have to get used to this because there are going to be a number of other enemies that are going to use these against the Romans down the road. But Pyrrhus is fighting in the style of warfare that is basically developed by Philip II and Alexander the Great. Now, a Macedonian-style phalanx looks a little bit like this. The older Greek phalanx, where you have, these 8-foot spears, you're lined up shield by shield, these big shields that you hold on one arm, you wield the spear in your right hand, the shield on your left, and you make a shield wall, was abandoned by the time of Alexander and replaced by what's called the Macedonian phalanx. And you're using a much smaller shield, which is slung over your shoulder, and your elbow is kind of attached there. But the reason you need a smaller shield and a less maneuverable shield is because instead of a spear, you're given a pike, which could be upward of 15 feet in length, and you need two hands to hold this thing. So as this type of phalanx is approaching you, you've got literally row after row after row of these pike tips coming forward the first line. So it's basically like approaching a porcupine. So you can see how in this illustration you've got not only the first line, but the second, third, fourth lines of soldiers all engaged in the battle. It's not just the first couple rows that can, do damage. It's multiple rows. And the guys behind with their sarissa, basically these long pikes, are held up, which gives you a little bit of a protection from above, from arrows and stuff, but not much. Anyways, it's not very maneuverable, as you would imagine. You can't turn to the side too easily without bringing your sarissa up, straight up in the air before you rotate. So what Alexander ultimately did, and the reason he was so successful, is this phalanx would be used to pin an enemy down from the front, and then Alexander, who commanded the cavalry, the horsemen, would ride in from the flanks or the back and attack the enemy from a safer direction. And the reason it was really important to use the cavalry charge from the sides or from the rear is because at this time the Greeks didn't have stirrups. It was very easy to get knocked off a horse if you were to engage from the front. Okay, so that was the style of warfare that the Macedonians had developed, and it was very useful against the older Greek phalanx. Now, how would it do against the Roman manipular legion? That's the question. Now, it did okay because Pyrrhus defeated the Romans in a number of initial battles at Heraclea, at Asculum, but he barely wins these engagements, which is why we have this idea of a Pyrrhic victory, which I talked to you guys about before. He says if we should win one more battle with the Romans, we will be truly lost, okay, or utterly defeated. Pyrrhus eventually goes to Sicily for a while, has a treaty with Carthage, comes back in Italy, and is ultimately defeated at the Battle of Maleventum, or later Beneventum, by the Romans. Now, if you look at the two types of soldiers side by side, I'll explain why the javelin was so important for the Romans. Here you've got a Greek or Macedonian style guy on the on the right, and the Roman style soldier on the left. With the pilum, this javelin, the Romans, from a safe distance, would launch these things. You'd usually carry, 2 or 3 pila. You would throw them over into the ranks of the Macedonians. And the pilum, which has this long metal shaft at the front, right before the tip, was kind of soft, so that when it made impact, it would bend. If it hit the ground, it would bend. If it hit a shield, it would pierce the shield, but the weight of the back end would continue to make the thing bend, so it would get stuck in the shield, which would force the guy carrying the shield to abandon the shield if he was going to continue to fight, which makes him more vulnerable. If it hits the ground and bends, that's fine. You can't throw the thing back. The Romans would then be able to engage these long pikes with their large shield and then push a way through until they were basically face to face, where that long pike is useless and that short sword is incredibly dangerous. So the Romans, again, and the reason I'm going into all this is really to show you how the Romans adapt. They adopt new techniques. It's kind of trial and error for the Romans, but their attitude is always, when you lose, like they did with Pyrrhus, you don't surrender. You figure out how to come back and, again, win the next battle. They're the type of people that never quit, and that's the reason their empire is going to not only be the largest empire in ancient Europe, but the longest-lasting empire out of all the ancient empires. Okay, so they do defeat Pyrrhus, and then Romans come to dominate the entire Italian peninsula for the most part by around 265. Now, this brings us to the Punic Wars. And I'm going to cover just a little bit further. I want to cover the first Punic War. I think it'll be a nice stopping point for our first discussion to kind of leave you with a cliffhanger. So let's go a little bit further and talk about the war with Carthage. This is the biggest war or series of wars of the Middle Republic. And Carthage is going to be the arch enemy of ancient Rome. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. So Punic is the word for the Phoenicians. This is the Latin word that refers to the Phoenicians. So here's the city of Carthage, which is located in North Africa. A little drawing of what the harbor of Carthage looked like. You can see on the map where Carthage was located. It's directly across from Sicily and Italy. It's the highest point in North Africa, closest to Europe. And it was founded probably in the 9th century BC. It's called originally Carthadas, the Phoenician term that meant the new city. And according to legend, it was founded by a queen from Tyre known as Elissa. And she was also referred to in a Roman legend as Queen Dido. We'll talk about her when we get to the Aeneid. Now, this is the only significant Phoenician world power. The Phoenician city-states in the Levant, right? This is the area of Canaan, the region that was over the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was conquered by numerous major empires, and it was never able to really develop into any kind of political power over there, even though it was a major commercial power. Carthage, they never were conquered, right? This was a colony that was founded in a very different place. They weren't conquered by the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or Alexander, so they were able to develop themselves into a fairly powerful commercial center and also a minor empire in the Western Mediterranean. They dominated North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and have relations early on with Rome. And they were fairly friendly in the beginning, right, since the early republics. As a matter of fact, there were a number of treaties formed with the Carthaginians, and trade was open between these groups. And neither seemed to have any goals of conquering the other until we get to the period just before not even just before, right at the time of the First Punic War. And here's how it begins. It begins with a conflict in Sicily with a town known as Messana, which is right at the tip of Sicily, right across from Italy. In 289, that city of Messana was taken by a group known as the Mamertines. Those were basically pirates, mercenary soldiers that had taken control of the city. Now, in 265, Messana is in conflict with Syracuse, which is, of course, the famous city just down south from Messana. The Mamertines request aid from the Carthaginians and the Romans to help against the Syracusans. Carthage actually sends some troops to help, but what they end up doing is garrisoning the city of Messana, in which case the Mamertines then want to get rid of the Carthaginians who have come in and imposed themselves on the city, and they then call to the Romans to help push the Carthaginians out. So kind of like the Peloponnesian War, which began with Corinth and Corcyra and pull in these other powers of Sparta and Athens. The same thing happens here. It's an issue between Messana and Syracuse, and they pull in the Carthaginians and the Romans. Now, the Romans need to fight in Sicily, and this is going to be a problem, as you'll see in a second. So it's 264, you eventually have the liberation of Messana. The Romans do cross into Sicily. Appius Claudius Codex ends the Carthaginian-Syracusan siege of Messana, and then Rome attacks Syracuse, and then ultimately makes it an ally, kind of forces it into alliance with Rome. And it's going to be an off and on ally throughout the Punic Wars until later they're going to conquer Syracuse, which the Athenians earlier failed to do. But we'll hold off on that till we get to the Second Punic War. The city of Acragas, 262-261. The Romans lay siege to the city. That's right there, Agrigentum or Acragas. The Romans defeat Carthage, take the city, but ultimately there's no real progress in the island of Sicily. Now here's the problem for the Romans. You're fighting against Carthage, which is a naval power, and the Romans are not a naval power. They're a land-based power. They don't have a fleet, but in 260, the Romans realize they need to counter Carthage with a navy, and they build their first fleet. What they do, again, here's the mathematics if you want to put it that way. Carthage is a naval power, Sicily's an island. 2 + 2 is 4. You need to build a navy. And what Rome does is they come across a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme, or wrecked ship, battleship. They salvage it, and then they reverse engineer the vessel and build a model. Now, the Romans are not great shipbuilders. They're working off of a Carthaginian design, but they end up building ships that ultimately are heavier, less maneuverable, and they don't have the experience that the Carthaginians do. So it's one thing, remember, to build a boat, but it's another thing to be able to sail the boat effectively and maneuver the boat in combat. So the Romans, again, are going to play to their strength. They're going to be innovative. They're going to adapt. And what they do in these early vessels is they construct a thing called the corvus. Now, if you look at this picture on your screen, that's a quinquereme battleship, and at the front of it, you can see this big contraption kind of pointing up at an angle. That's called the corvus, or the beak. The crow. And the corvus, what they would do with this thing is they would get close to an enemy vessel, and rather than worrying about maneuvering to ram, they would just pull up as close as they could to the vessel, and then they would drop this bridge down onto the deck of the enemy ship. And there would be a spike at the tip of the corvus, which would stick into the deck so that the ship can't break free. And then, rather than fight a naval battle, they would usually keep a group of soldiers on the deck, a larger group of soldiers on the deck of the Roman ship, who would march over to the enemy vessel and basically fight a land battle. That's where they were strong. So they're going to turn naval warfare into land warfare, right? Again, playing to their strengths. Now, this early Roman navy actually does win some very basic battles early on. 260, the Battle of Mylae. Gaius Duilius defeats the Carthaginian fleet under Hannibal Gisco, and that's the first victory. But overall, the Romans don't win that many battles at sea. I mean, the Carthaginians are still better sailors. They're more experienced. And the other big problem the Romans have is that particular design with the corvus sticking way up makes the ship a little bit top-heavy. And they notice pretty early on that when you have rough waters and storms, those ships tend to capsize and sink. So that's not something they're always going to maintain. But let's take a look at what happens. The general situation in the war is Rome will win a few naval battles early on, but Carthage generally controls the sea. Rome took the majority of the territory in Sicily, but never really conquering all of, or defeating really all of the Carthaginian armies. Carthage continues to hold the western portion of the island, particularly at Lilybaeum and Drepana. The Romans aren't able to take those. And then the big general in Sicily was a guy by the name of Hamilcar Barca. We're going to talk about him in a little bit next time as well, briefly. He is going to keep the Romans at bay, and he never loses an engagement with the Roman army. So he's fairly confident that if allowed enough time, he could win the war for Carthage. Both sides are going bankrupt in the meantime. I mean, the war lasts for, from 264 to 241. This is a very long and dragged out conflict. Ultimately, the Romans lose fleet after fleet. They're running out of money to rebuild their navy. And then near the end of the war, they get some funds that are given to them by the richer Campanian nobles in southern Italy. So around 243, they have a final fleet constructed on a new design based off a Rhodian ship. And Gaius Lutatius Catullus decides he's going to drill this fleet and make them into really good sailors, and then is going to be able to intercept reinforcements to the island of Sicily, which are very much in need by the land forces in Sicily. So that's ultimately what's going to turn the tide for the Romans. Now, in 241, you have the Battle of the Gates Islands. Lutatius defeats the Carthaginian fleet, preventing reinforcements. Carthage immediately surrenders after the Battle of the Gates Island. Now, this angers the general there in Sicily, Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar does not want to surrender. He has never lost against the Romans and is going to hold a grudge against Rome for years afterward, and complains to the Carthaginian the government about this premature surrender in 241. The treaty that is signed is called the Treaty of Lutatius, and the Romans gain control of Sicily, but the big thing is the punishment that they inflict on the loser. Carthage has to pay a heavy penalty. Basically, what happens if you're on the losing side of an ancient battle or war, you need to pay for that war. And they have the stipulations that they need to get rid of their fleet, which is going to really wreck the economy of Carthage, because this is a naval commercial power. So you have to have no more fleet, and you have to pay within a period of about 10 years 200 talents of silver, which is a lot of money. A talent is about 70 pounds of metal. All right, so 200 talents, that's a lot of money. And again, Carthage themselves have gone bankrupt in the meantime. So last thing I'm going to give you is what happens in the interbellum period, right? The period between the First and Second Wars. Carthaginians bankrupt, not able to pay their army, which they basically employed a good amount of mercenaries, have revolts among their mercenaries. The government needs to figure out how to deal with them. This takes a little bit of time, but ultimately the mercenary revolts are put down. Sardinia and Corsica end up rebelling during this time from Carthage and are ultimately given to Rome. So Rome ends up not only with the island of Sicily, but Sardinia and Corsica. Carthaginians then start to expand in Spain. Hamilcar sees Spain as an opportunity to gain more power and more wealth, and to build up, a base of operations for a future encounter with Rome. Hamilcar, as a matter of fact, goes to Spain with his sons. Among his sons was his son Hannibal. All right, and he apparently has his 3 sons swear an oath that they are one day going to gain vengeance for Carthage against Rome. And that's what's going to eventually set up the Second Punic War. But the last thing, around 226, is what's called the Ebro Treaty, signed with the Romans, which basically sets up the Ebro River in Spain as the boundary. You can see the little red line I just drew on the map. Boundary between Carthaginian territory or sphere of influence and Roman sphere of influence to the north. Romans can engage with the peoples north of that line, even though they don't own the territory, but they can't interfere with the south. That's Carthaginian. Now the Romans themselves form a treaty with a particularly important town known as Saguntum, circled right there on the map. Saguntum is, notice, on the Carthaginian side of the river. And this particular situation is going to be the setup for the Second Punic War. So that's, I think, a perfect place to leave us with a cliffhanger. When we come back for our next lecture on ancient Rome, we're going to look at the Second Punic War, and then we're going to work our way down to the actual end of the Roman Republic in 27 BC. So until then, take care.